Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ananya Roy, and it gives me great pleasure to co-chair this closing session with Daryl DeMonte. We have a full panel of speakers as well as discussants joining us here for this closing session. So we're going to get started. The session, as you know, is called Governing India's Future, Are Cities Getting Smarter? I want to make two amendments to that. We want to consider the ways in which governing India's future is tied up with the making of urban futures. And we want to think not only about cities getting smarter or not, but also following on the heels of the previous panel, we want to think about whether cities are getting more just. So without further ado, we're going to turn it over to our speakers.
So we'll begin with Ishtar Judge Ahluwalia, who's the chair of the Indian Council for Research on International Economic Relations. Will you go to the podium or speak from here? Whichever you prefer. From here? Okay, you have 10 minutes.
Well, friends, first of all, let me confess that since I was at Mussoorie speaking to the trainees of Indian Administrative Service yesterday, I could not be at this conference, which puts me at a disadvantage on whatever was discussed. But let me share with you why I feel we need better cities. I would just say we need better cities, which means we need cleaner cities, we need smarter cities, we need greener cities, we need more inclusive cities, we need just cities. So I think you can interpret better any which way that you like. The truth is, today we have 2/3 of our GDP coming from urban areas, and it's projected to be 75% by 2031. Are our cities acting as engines of growth? Do our cities provide the kind of environment in which investors and innovators and skilled people would want to come create wealth, which can then be redistributed and what have you? And the answer is we have a long, long way to go. And I would say that if we do not get better cities which provide better service delivery, better connectivity, better quality of air, better water, and all that, forget about better growth, you won't get any growth. I think for financial and environmental sustainability of our growth, urbanization has to be the centerpiece for our development in the years ahead. And it is as important for rural rejuvenation as it is for improving the quality of life in urban areas. We need to connect our urban areas to our rural areas. And one of the things that I posed to my very senior colleagues from state governments yesterday when I engaged with them, these were all state government secretary level people, that today states have a very important role in our development. They are the principal actors of development. We've really come into our own in our federal setup where states are playing a very important role. Today we have a prime minister who came from a state government as chief minister, and he's leading the country. But are the states ready to decentralize and devolve funds, functions, and functionaries so that our local governments, our city governments can be empowered to deliver the services for which the Constitution has made them accountable? And in fact, my answer to this is this requires more investment. This requires making more funds available to city governments. Maybe the goods and services tax we can use as the first opportunity to devolve a small percentage of that straight to the city governments so they have some oxygen to run. And then the question of connecting cities with each other, cities with rural areas, and all that comes up. very often we tend to say that if we can have public-private partnerships, or if we have capital market bonds issued for municipal governments, they will have the funding and they can do the job. I disagree. I think our most important challenge today is governance, which means strengthening our institutions of service delivery, and capacity to plan and manage. And this is as wanting at the state government level as it is at the local government level. So I reject the proposition that we cannot decentralize because our local governments cannot be trained. I think we must begin where we need to begin, and we must engage society, engage the people. I am a strong believer that if we demand good governance, the supply of good governance will come. Have I covered my 10 minutes?
You have another 4 or 5 minutes.
I do. Wonderful, wonderful. Then I can go a little bit deeper into it. Now, what do I mean by better governance? You know, today we have a situation in which if a local government, a city government is responsible for delivering drinking water, and they want to charge so that the user charges cover at least the operation and maintenance costs, they need the approval of the state government before they can do it. 50% of the revenue of a city government comes from transfers from the state government and the government of India, which means that come election time, and some state government decides that they are going to give exemption to properties below 10 lakh from paying property taxes. So what happens if you're a municipal commissioner, overnight, your revenue is cut into half. So we really have a situation where the Constitution said that the city will be responsible for drinking water, for wastewater treatment, for stormwater drains, for solid waste management, but they said finances will come through the setting up of a state finance commission, which will tell the state government how to give a certain part of their revenue to city governments. Now, every state government has set up a state finance commission, naam ke vaste, for namesake. They are not devolving funds. So we have a situation in which those who are closer to the ground are accountable, but they have no resources with which to deliver these services. And at the same time, we have a situation, we talk of smart cities today. We also talk of clean cities, which is, I'm delighted that we are talking of this because we need this and much more. But we have cities where, on average, only 30% of our sewage is treated in urban India. So when we say clean cities, we have to work not only to build toilets and to sweep the dust or garbage from outside of our homes or streets, but we need to ensure that that garbage is processed, recycled, disposed of in a scientific manner so that our water and our air is clean. And the public health implications of the neglect of water and sanitation have really not been understood in our country, and increasingly we are paying for it through new diseases, new epidemics. And I think when we talk of health, instead of thinking in terms of primary health centers and secondary health centers and tertiary hospitals, we should really be thinking about clean cities and villages, which means, we should have clean drinking water. Even when we talk of clean drinking water, normally we restrict ourselves to piped network for the delivery of water and augmentation of the bulk water supply. What we don't realize is that if we do not treat our wastewater, if our sewage just runs into our open drains, we are polluting groundwater and we are polluting our river bodies. So, when you actually look at it this way, it's really quite frightening. So I think definitely we need clean, green, just, smart, all those cities, but we must really clean up our act by first working at the water and sanitation level, at the level of transport, land use, traffic congestion decrease, so that we can improve the quality of air, so we can breathe freely. With those words, I will stop. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll now call upon Harsh Manda from the Center for Equity Studies.
Friends, a couple of months back, something happened that happens quite regularly in Delhi. An SUV at night, driven by a drunk young man, ran over 11 homeless people. That particular incident affected me a little more closely than each of those that we hear, because we were running a homeless shelter just a few hundred yards away from where these people got ran over. Who were they? They actually were all working men, single working men who came into the city sometimes 5, 10, 15 years ago because there were no options in their village to keep their families alive, and who could not spend even on getting a house for themselves because it wasn't available at a cost that they could afford. If they spent it on themselves, there was nothing left to spend back to their village. But the question was, why do they sleep so close to the highway, where they are, and even on traffic islands? And when I spoke to them, they told me that it's, why they sleep on the streets is clear, but why they sleep so close to the highway is because of mosquitoes. If they sleep even a little bit further away from the highway, the mosquitoes make it impossible to sleep. So they actually, the closer you come to the highway, the automobile fumes, drive away the mosquitoes, and that is how they can catch a few hours of sleep. And I really began to think of the city that we live in, where in order to have a few hours of fitful sleep, you destroy your lungs forever, and you risk your neck every night. So when we talk about smart cities, I wonder. Noam Chomsky had come to Delhi recently, and he said something in an interview. He said that he'd never seen a place in the world where poverty is so dramatically manifest on the streets as he sees in a place like Delhi. But he's also never seen a people who have developed this capacity to look and then turn their faces away. Our absence of outrage at enormous suffering in an extremely unequal city and an extremely uncaring city is the context in which I thought we must have our discussions. So for me, a smart city is not a city which hides, blocks, drives away, is ashamed of its poor. It's a city which cares, which includes its most disadvantaged citizens. Delhi, about 40 to 50%, this city that I live in, it's an estimated 40 to 50% people live in slums, many of them are unauthorized. You know the amount of land that they occupy? They occupy 3%. This 50% of the population occupy 3% of the residential land. And Mrs. Sheila Dikshit was here. There's a sense of almost, bemoaning the fact that why do so many migrants come over from different parts of the country into the city? How can we manage? But we need to understand that the entire economic model on which we have built our economic growth is actually driving people away from the countryside into the cities. This, agriculture, still employs about 60% of the country's population, contributes about 15% of the GDP, just has 5% of public investment. And Mr. Chidambaram, the former foreign minister, finance minister, in one of his interviews said his dream India was one in which 80% people live in cities. My point is that if that is our dream city, our dream country, why are poor people who migrate to cities made to feel so unwelcome? So there's almost an implied hierarchy of citizenship in cities. People like us are the legitimate citizens of the city. And the poorer you are, the more vulnerable you are, the less legitimate a citizen you are. So for the rural poor, at least the state is constructed, the state's policies are constructed around the premise that the rural poor have rights and the state has duties towards them, positive duties towards them. Towards the urban poor, it's almost as if the state only has duties against them. So most urban policies for the urban poor is block, demolish, relocate. There's nothing that is constructive about their right to an equal life of dignity, especially because they are the ones who build the city, who run the city. And this extreme sort of, I mean, so I come into the city gives me opportunities, it allows me to survive because there's nothing that I can do to keep my family alive in the village. But when I come here, and I also escape caste, if I'm a woman, I escape some degrees of the patriarchy. So city gives me opportunities. But the city is not planned and designed, and its laws and the whole regulatory framework is not designed to include me as an equal citizen. And so all my efforts for habitat, for livelihood, are actually almost in a continuous process of war with the state. And it is not so difficult. I mean, the challenges are large to have a more inclusive city, but it is not really so difficult to think of solutions. I'll just take 3 or 4, in the very brief period that I have, 3 or 4 very simple examples. Let us take the street child. The street child is probably, even within the city, the most vulnerable among the vulnerable. And each of our cities, Delhi has an estimated 50,000 street children who sleep on the streets. And these are children I've come to work with and come to know closely. The large majority of them are children, very brave kids who've run away from extremely abusive, violent, deprived backgrounds and abuse and are trying to survive somehow alone on the streets. The only way, and it's quite clear that the only way that we can provide for them is in open, caring residential schools and hostels, which give them comprehensive care. So Delhi would need 500 residential schools for street children. Now, that might seem, is that an investment that we are willing to make? Where is the land going to come from? Where is the money going to come from? Is it important enough? And yet, actually, if you really think hard, and starting working with street kids, the idea arose that there's an Irish sister in Calcutta who really showed us the way. A street girl got raped just outside the gates of her school, and she suddenly began to think, and she realized that actually 18 hours of the day when the school is closed, those are the very hours when the child on the street is most vulnerable. So the simple idea was, why don't we open up all our day schools for homeless children? Simple idea. She built an extra story on her school, insisted that the children would come in, and gradually over a year, the children got acclimatized, healed for all their suffering, and began to join the regular school. And at very low cost, we were actually able to provide. And I thought, let us try to do that with public schools, with government schools. And so we've done that in about 45, running day schools, just at the cost of about 10 lakh rupees. You can refurbish an existing government school, add a few rooms, add a toilet, and a child gets a new life. The physical spaces exist. It's the spaces in our hearts that we need to create. I was asked to chair the Urban Health Mission, a committee to look at what is the Urban Health Mission doing for the urban poor. And we found almost a complete exclusion. Actually, when we asked what happens to the urban poor when they fall ill and they live in really insanitary conditions, what they told us was that most of all, about 25% of them just do nothing because there's just no way that they can do anything about their illness. A large majority of the rest, the only person they consult is the pharmacist, the boy at the pharmacist store who tells them this is what you can get. There's no public hospitals that are available to them. And the few that exist, they run in the mornings and it doesn't work for them. The locations don't work for them. And their costs, nobody gives them free medicines. So it is simple. I mean, if we say that every 10,000 population should have a dedicated primary health center, which is run in the evenings, which is cashless, which is accessible to them, things can work out. We have to think of a whole continuum. I mean, when homeless people were dying on the streets, went to the Supreme Court, and got a simple order from the government that shelters, just simple shelters, is the least that a government can do so that people don't have to risk their necks to be able to have a night's sleep. A homeless woman that I spoke to said, after getting into a shelter for the first time in 17 years, can I close my eyes at night and be assured that no one is going to rape me? Is that the very minimum that any city must provide? And it's not just shelters. You need working men's dormitories. You need rental housing. These are not difficult solutions to imagine. The only point that I want to make is this city belongs to you, it belongs to me, but it also belongs to millions of people who have come into the city to earn a living, to keep their families alive, to have a better future. And we need to plan our cities for both. A smart city is one which cares. Thank you.
We have to thank all the speakers for keeping absolutely to time, and we'll have Irina Vittal now.
Thank you for being here this late on a Saturday evening. I'm going to quickly take you through my definition of smart, and it's largely around governance. First of all, the context of this is that India is a very reluctant urbanizer. It basically recognized cities only in the last 20 years. Before that, under the fig leaf of India lives in her villages, we didn't really think very much about our cities. It was a recent, relatively recent constitutional amendment that recognized cities. But to Isha's point, the devolution of powers and money has still not fully happened. But citizens don't know this, and citizens continue to move to the cities. So while on paper, India is about 30% urbanized, if you relax the tough three-part definition of urban in India, perhaps 52% of India is urbanized even today as we speak. More importantly, cities are going to be important for our future. They will have another 250 million people, but more importantly, they will account for 70% of jobs. And for a country as young as this, 70% of all new jobs will be created in the city. And this, by the way, is without assuming Make in India becomes real. A lot of this will be in services. A lot of them will be in industry. Like every other country in the world, cities will be the important engines of growth. And yet, what is equally exciting is to notice that it won't be a marginal issue. It's wonderful to see this government has legitimized urbanization by talking about 100 smart cities. Now, 100 smart cities by themselves are not going to solve India's problems because we have 7,239 cities. And however smart the 100 cities are, the real issue is going to be to make sure there is rejuvenation of the 7,000 plus existing cities. And hopefully, the pressure on this will happen because there will be 5 states which will be more than half urban in the next couple of years. And we will have 68 cities with populations of more than 1 million, while all of Europe has only 35. What's fascinating about India's cities is that they are actually countries in the making. If you look at Bombay or Delhi or Calcutta, by 2030, the GDP of these countries will be the size of Malaysia. And yet, if you think of our mental construct of cities, it's basically run by a bureaucrat, more often than not very brilliant, who's there for 2 years, doesn't understand the complex city systems that make for a city, and has literally 2 sweepers and 3 clerks who work with him. And this is real. If you look at Bangalore, which has 8 million population, the same as New York has 200,000 people who work for the mayor, and Bangalore has 20,000, 18,000 of who are sweepers. the teeth-to-tail ratio of our cities is very interesting. So in our minds, cities are still grown villages, but our cities are complex, and they're huge, and they require a completely different way of governance. And you can already see that the city's current situation is grim. Isha talked about 30% sewage. We have 24% of our urban population in slums. Only 70% of solid waste is collected, and so on and so forth. And the situation will get even worse because across board, all services are going to require a 4 to 7 time increase. Just in affordable housing, we need 44 million units. And by the way, the Indian model of affordable housing is constructed and sold. But what we really need is rental stock. And we have to build so much, which is why, while at one level you can be very pessimistic about cities, cities are also a great opportunity to grow the Indian economy and, more importantly, to create inclusion and jobs. What is very clear is India needs a new operating model. And the new operating model is around funding. We need $1 trillion for CapEx. We need another $1 trillion for OpEx. And by the way, all of this can be funded because our cities have not monetized land, they don't collect taxes, and more importantly, because none of them have a P&L or a balance sheet, they haven't raised any amount of debt. So this money can be raised, it's just that we haven't done it. We need sector policies on economic growth, on affordable housing, on land, on sustainability, on how do we have mixed living. We need planning, but most importantly, we need governance. And I'm going to talk to you over the next 5 minutes primarily on what I think we need in governance. Without governance, which is the big elephant in the room, the rest of it will not happen. This country has a lot of argumentative people. It has a lot of brilliant people. The fact that we have a problem is known. The fact that we have multiple solutions is known. What fascinates me after looking at this sector for 10 years is why on earth don't we address this issue? And it comes back squarely to governance. And that's what I'd like to talk to you about. For me, the big issue in governance is, this is my definition of smart, and I'm trying to be cute here, so stay with me. For me, the first thing is structure. We need 20 cities to be metropolitan municipal structures, just to be able to define what is the job of a city. And already we have 20, and if you really push the states, they might say that there are 40. A simple thing like defining what the role of a city is would be a great way to start. And because Indians hate non-Indian examples, we have lovely examples within the country. Calcutta has done some of this. We don't need fragmentation of cities. We need consolidation of governance. Bangalore, in the last 3 years, tripled the size of the municipality just by redrawing the map. But they are right now thinking of breaking up the municipality. It should be the other way around. So the first thing we need to do in our governance is really define the role of our cities and recognize that some of our cities need metropolitan structures and municipal structures will not work. The second thing is we need mayors, one day elected, but at least for now empowered. We are the only country in the world who run our cities with usually brilliant IS officers, and they weep. The good ones among them weep, because the tier below them is all on deputation. They come from rural, or they come from teaching, or they come from some other department. Just by the time they understand what it takes to run their department, they get sent back to where they come from. And you can't run cities of the size of our country with people on the move, people who don't understand that this requires competency and this requires complexity. Third, we need accountability. It's fascinating for me that the last 2 finance commissions of India have talked about something as simple as having accounting standards for Indian cities. None of our cities, with perhaps the exception of 4, do double account entries. We don't publish our P&Ls. We don't publish our balance sheets. How on earth will we raise the $1 trillion if we're never going to be able to show how we use our funds? We don't have right pricing because all pricing immediately becomes political. We don't even understand how to price. By the way, in different parts of the country, in different parts of the economy, we understand pricing now because we've created institutional mechanisms for them. We need to create mechanisms by which we can price all our services well. And we need to have better recovery mechanisms because we barely collect what we price. Again, examples for this exist within India. Bangalore does double accounting entries. Surat has a good model. One other state in the south is starting to talk about publishing their reports every quarter. For me, the art talks about reliable agencies. You don't serve 33 million people or 22 million people with government departments on all of the stuff, from stormwater drain to education to hospitals to garbage. We need to have agencies for service delivery. And again, there are enough examples of this because we're talking of corporatization. We're not necessarily talking of the word that scares India, which is privatization. But we have to create agency structures to deliver services to the scale that India wants. And finally, we need talent. We need capacity to build complex systems. First, we need granular norms. Every city doesn't need the same number of people. Second, we need roaming pools of technical experts. You're never going to have city-specific transport experts. We need a roaming pool of them. We need to outsource standard functions, maybe HR, maybe finance, maybe maintenance. We need municipal cadres, and in the interim, private talent. And we need to go beyond employment agencies. The great municipal leaders today can only go to the employment agency to hire people. And the employment agency has really old people who don't necessarily fit the job that we need. But perhaps the most important thing we need is the political system of this country to realize that their political cadre can be built at the city level. The mayor of Florence is the prime minister of Italy. The mayor of a city is the president of Indonesia. China has recognized this. And to me, the real solution for fixing India's governance, getting structure, mayors, accountability, reliable service delivery, and talent, is if some political party in the center or in the state recognizes that this is actually the best way of getting their votes of tomorrow. For the first time in the last election, city votes mattered, which is why JNNURM was launched by the last government. It was a wonderful initiative, and this government is talking of 100 smart cities. So in a chaotic democracy where votes matter, urban votes are now material. The day a political party realizes that they need political cadres, and the best way of building political cadres is city mayors, India's problems will be solved. The only thing that's stopping us is political will, and finding an interim solution for all the rent that they get from the land jiggery-pokery that happens in our cities. But what we're really looking for to fix India's governance issues is not technical solutions, no new insights for India, just a political leader who realizes that the mayor of Bombay is potentially the chief minister of Maharashtra, and one day the prime minister of this country. Thank you.
Well, I think it's typical of the smart manner in which Urban Age manages conferences that we've left the official to speak last. It was a pleasant change. And we have Mr. Shankar Agarwal, who's the Secretary for Urban Development for the country.
Thank you very much, sir. Panelists on the high table, ladies and gentlemen, it's my proud privilege to be here this afternoon and to share some of the views on urbanization and the new initiative taken by the Government of India. For the last 65 years, our focus has been primarily on the rural development, and rightly so, because large number of people used to live in rural areas, and they were very, very poor. There was a question of survival, starvation deaths, and it was necessary for the government to take stock of the situation to ensure that the lives in rural areas are not compromised. Secondly, there was a question of scarcity of food. In 1947, when we gained independence, we were importing large quantities of food grain. So we paid attention to agriculture, to farmers, and today we are not only self-sufficient in terms of food production, we are exporting large quantities of food grain to many parts of the world. And the credit goes to our farmers, credit goes to our scientists. But after 65 years, and especially when we started growing at a rate of almost 9% and 9 plus, initially we were growing at a rate of 2.5, and for many years, we kept growing at a rate of 3.5%. And nobody at that point of time ever thought that India would be growing at a rate of 8 or 9%. And we used to call it Hindu rate of growth. And then suddenly we started growing 5%, 6%, 7%, 8%, 9%, and 9 plus. The entire world was amazed. And suddenly we had become the darling of the entire world. But this growth of 9% or even 10% is not going to serve any purpose. It's not going to be sustainable unless we take care of our poor people. Still about 25, 27% people live below the poverty line. It's a huge number, almost 400 million. And there are large number of people who belong to the disadvantaged section of society who are not the part of this success story. And if we had to take care of them, if we had to bring in happiness, if we want to have sustainable growth, it is necessary that we take care of people who belong to scheduled caste, scheduled tribe, backward, minorities, and women. And if we had to have a sustainable growth and a robust growth of 9% plus, it is necessary that we take stock of our cities and towns. And that's why this government, the present government, has paid a lot of attention, a lot of focus to the growth and the development of towns. We are today passing through a very exciting time. We have got a leadership which is focused, which is passionate about development, and which is creating an environment of conducive and sustainable and inclusive growth. And under this, the new government has taken 4 big initiatives in the urbanization process. The first and the foremost is Clean India Movement, Swachh Bharat Abhiyan. And idea is to make this country absolutely neat and clean by 2019, to mark the 150th birthday of Mahatma Gandhi ji. Wherever you go, you'll find heaps and heaps of garbage. Huge problem. And this ultimately results in loss of valuable lives, diseases, and a whole lot of other problems. So can we keep this country absolutely neat and clean? Absolutely, yes. It requires primarily a change in the mindset. That is a little difficult process, but certainly with collaboration, with sustainable effort, I'm sure that we'll be able to achieve it, and we are confident also to achieve it by 2019. The second big ticket initiative taken by the government is rejuvenation of our heritage town. We go to these heritage towns, whether it is Banaras or Mathura or Ajmer, Amritsar, we go to these places to get some kind of mental peace, some kind of solace. But instead of getting peace, when we go there, our mind gets agitated. And why so? Because of garbage, because of lack of civic services. Small services are just not available in these places. So idea was to let us rejuvenate the soul of these towns, which are culturally and religiously very, very important to each one of us. The third big initiative is urban renewal of 500 cities. In 2004, we had taken an initiative called JNNURM, and under that, we had taken up almost 65 cities. But that time, our approach was basically based on the projects. And the results are a little mixed kind of a bag. Some failures, some successes, but overall it is 50-50. Now we are taking stock of that, and instead of only 65 cities, we are going to take care of all 500 cities which have got a population of 100,000 plus. And approach would be a program-based approach. That means we have to look into the cities holistically, and wherever there is a gap, we got to fill that gap in terms of urban infrastructure, in terms of many other civic services. And this mission is going to be launched very soon. And the fourth big ticket item is development of 100 smart cities. And why smart cities? Smart cities because it is only the technology which can bring in a big change. Wherever people have made progress, wherever the societies have made progress, it is only because of the technology. Today, we are supposed to be the world leader in ICT. Wherever you go, you'll find Indian technocrats, Indian engineers, Indian software experts creating wealth for everyone, creating wealth for nations, creating wealth for corporate entities. But we have not been able to take advantage of that to the common man within this country. And idea is to take advantage of the knowledge available, to take advantage of the expertise available within the country, and to make our cities smarter. But that is only a thin layer. And under that thin layer, we got to take care of the urban infrastructure as well. And urban infrastructure includes basically the four parts. The first is institutional infrastructure. And when I call institutional infrastructure, that means the governance. And idea is that all public services have to be delivered in electronic mode. Nobody needs to go to a government office to seek a public service or to get the delivery of public service. And it can be achieved very quickly, not much of a problem. Secondly, that all information has to be in public domain, whether it's the functioning of an STP or the resources of a urban local body or the accounting system, everything has to be in public domain. And the third is the citizen engagement. And they had to be a participant in the decision-making process, and this is what we are trying to achieve under the smart cities. The second area is physical infrastructure. That means 24/7 water supply, 24/7 electric supply, a very, very robust cyber connectivity. Why can't we take fiber to each and every home? Even in a place like Delhi, Bombay, Calcutta, you do not have good quality and reliable connectivity. And that's not a big deal. It can be achieved very quickly, and that too by the private sector. And then urban mobility. You travel from Dwarka to, say, Noida, or you travel from the central Delhi to airport. You spend an hour and a half. Can't we cut it down to 30 minutes? Can we give an assurance and a commitment to our citizen that nobody will take more than, say, 30 minutes to travel from place A to place B anywhere in the city? And that is achievable, that is doable, it's not difficult. We have to put our best foot forward. We got to have collaboration, cooperation of everyone, and I'm sure that if we work together, whether it is academia, R&D institution, citizen, private sector, public sector, formal sector, informal sector, if we get together, if we have got passion, if we have got determination and perseverance, surely we'll be able to achieve that. Idea is to bring peace and prosperity to everyone in this country and a big smile on the face of everyone. Thank you very much.
We now have almost an hour to have a panel discussion with all the members who are around this table. But may I take the liberty of asking the first question to Mr. Agarwal? Although we have been talking about informing citizens about projects that are on the anvil, we've heard this morning about the Delhi-Mumbai Industrial Corridor. And I don't think most citizens are aware of how much land in which state is going to be earmarked for this project. And it's of some concern. Also, we've heard just 2 days ago the railway minister talking about Delhi to Chennai rail corridor to reach in 6 hours flat. Apart from the technology and the expense, where is the land available? How is it going to be acquired? And is there a danger of a lopsided development in this country that we have from north to west, cutting across the peninsula, an industrial commercial corridor, whereas the whole of eastern India largely is left untouched, perhaps?
You see, I'll not be able to comment on the industrial corridor because that's not a subject of my ministry. As far as my ministry is concerned, our objective is, and our mission is to develop 100 smart cities. And when we talk about 100 smart cities, we are talking about the existing cities. That means it is a brownfield development and not a greenfield development. And within the city, you can always find some land either at the periphery or you can go in for the redevelopment. I give you an example of Delhi. Why can't we redevelop the area of Paharganj and New Delhi railway station? It is nothing but an urban sprawl. And adjoining area, which is Connaught Place, is supposed to be one of the most expensive area in the world. It is only because we do not have enough spaces for commercial operation, for institutional operation, or even for the residential. And we can go in for high-rise building, maybe 80 stories, 60 stories, 100 stories, and we can have large number of open spaces, green spaces, water bodies, entertainment. so that people can get together, they can discuss, they can exchange ideas, views, and they can enjoy this. And this is what we are trying to achieve. And this is about the redevelopment, but if you go a little further, let's take, say, Dwarka. It's like a greenfield kind of a thing, but it's not a pure greenfield city development. It's an adjoining area which can be developed into a beautiful city, a beautiful township. And this is what we are trying to achieve.
So what I'd like to do is perhaps use the presentations by the speakers to pose questions of our panelists. And I'm going to place all of the questions on the table so that if you don't like the question I'm posing to you, you can pick someone else's. So I'm going to start with Jagan Shah. So Ishrat Ahluwalia outlined a vision of better cities, and she argued that we must demand and create these better cities. So I'd like to hear from you, who is the we who would articulate and implement this vision of better cities? And again, other panelists are welcome to answer these questions. My next question is for Richard Sennett. Harsh Mandar started his presentation with this really poignant image of the homeless body seeking fitful sleep, an image almost of bare life that marks the impossibility of our thinking about urban citizenship or even possibly urban residence. In what ways do we imagine futures, urban futures, in those contexts of stark inequality? Not just in India, but anywhere in the world. You can answer any question. That's why I'm being democratic and putting them all out on the table. So this is a question for Gerald Frug. We're hearing a lot today, of course, about smart cities, about 100 smart cities, as well as Irina Vithel's reinscribing of the idea of what a smart city might look like. So what are smart cities, Gerald? And finally, for Anumita, again, going back to Harsh's presentation, he provoked us to think about the ways in which, despite such inequalities in Indian cities, despite the bodies literally on our streets, there is an absence of outrage. How do we imagine and enact social change if there is an absence of outrage? And I'm reminded here of a colleague of mine who's not in the room, Mustafa Dikej, who recently has been arguing that the urban age is also possibly an age of urban rage in many parts of the world. But if there's an absence of outrage, how then do we imagine and enact social change? So the floor now belongs to the panelists. I will go in the order in which I pose questions, but as I said, you don't have to answer the question I pose to you. Jagan.
Right. Thank you. Thank you, Ananya. Yeah, I guess it's a pretty good question. Who is the we? Who is the we that Ishar spoke about as demanding a better city? I think I'll try to link this with what are smart cities. I'd like to do that because a part of what we are trying to support the project of making smart cities, part of what we're doing is to try and sort of flesh out what might be the processes by which we come to grips with this we, what the Secretary mentioned as a consultative, participative process. I think in a city like Delhi, and I will focus only on Delhi, this we is made up of a very diverse number of interests. I think there is a very large number of youth because Delhi is an education hub for the country and is becoming an education hub for the region as well. And a large number of youth who actually don't have much of a voice at all. And they don't really participate very much, except in student politics, for instance. So the results from student union elections in the universities of Delhi are very interesting, and the kinds of battles that get fought on those campuses are very interesting. So there's one huge chunk of who are sort of higher secondary school students becoming college students, university students, who are actually getting intellectually trained, and they have a voice that never really gets registered by the political class or by the bureaucracy. And they're very important to us because we're building these smart cities for them. Then there is the huge block that we label and actually homogenize as this urban poor, and very problematic label that we attach to them, because that urban poor probably, I mean, it's very elastic, that definition, because if we talk about people who are disadvantaged, and I did see the word disadvantaged, then I think many of the working class who might be defined as lower middle class and not poor, are very disadvantaged because their children have to commute very long distances to school, or they can't get their children into schools at all, or they face various kinds of health issues because they live in polluted areas. So there's this whole sort of nebulous idea of the urban poor, which is not really poor, but they're just simply deprived in many different ways. And I would like to describe it like that. There are millions of people in the city who are deprived of what we consider to be basic infrastructure or basic goods. And then there is a very large elite, and a very powerful and strong elite. And I can't recall who mentioned, I think Enrique mentioned the very powerful elites that have a lot of capital at their disposal, and they influence a lot of decisions. So if I can take just these three, and then there are many others as well, but if we just take these three, I think the smart cities that we're talking about will probably, with the use of or access of big data and evidence which can be laid on the table, so to speak, be able to set up more informed debates and dialogues between these multiple constituencies that make up this very, very fractured city. And I think that's the hope that the smart city offers us, the use of this technology offers us, where perhaps we will be able to harness the kind of information about processes of government, processes of making the city, operations, and so on, which can actually be shared and not have to be debated whether the provenance of this data is correct or not. And I'll give you a very quick example of this. The Rajiv Awas Yojana was mentioned today. We're looking at some data about the Rajiv Awas Yojana, and the questionnaire that is used to use for targeting of beneficiaries of the scheme has some 200 questions. And a lot of those questions are very problematic. And of course, the answers to those questions are evasive, and obviously so. You don't want to answer certain kinds of very personal, targeted questions. Now, if we use that kind of data to set up the implementation of a scheme like that, let alone the land tenure issue, which is what was mentioned earlier, you're bound to get it wrong. And mistakes are becoming more and more expensive, if not disastrous. So smartness in our cities might at least get the targeting of government programs right. That might help greatly. That might be a good step forward. And I think this line between the expenditure on infrastructure, which is basically controlling flows and then controlling these static entities like buildings and open spaces, and citizens, is that line of justice that you asked about in the beginning of the session. Justice is in this interface between all of this sort of stuff that we can build and all of that, and the goods that we can deliver to these citizens. That's my answer.
Thank you, Jagan. Richard, we'll turn this over to you.
Well, maybe I can approach your impossible question by saying that the most thrilling experience I had when we toured Delhi last few days was Nehru Place. It embodies everything. This is a huge market of illegal and perhaps even legal electronic goods embodies everything as an urbanist that I think is really desirable in cities. It's got lots of people, it's very dense, it includes poor people and less poor people. It's a living environment and a productive environment. What it isn't is an equal environment. And I say this to you because the whole discourse about inequality seems to me to be predicated on a sociological falsehood, which is that inequality in itself is something that we have to look at as a kind of wound. Societies have lived with inequality and hierarchy since the beginning of civilization. It's the conditions under which people are unequal that seem to me to matter. And what cities can do, as in places like Nehru Place, is not make inequality a cause of despair, but rather introduce other factors which mean that even if people are of very different socioeconomic status, they're not depressed by that fact. And to me, one of the tasks of planning is to create those kinds of open, porous spaces in which the unequal people can nonetheless acquire agency. This is my great argument with Thomas Piketty, for whom inequality as such is an evil. And I just don't feel that's correct. What I do want to say about this is that in my view, neoliberal capitalism tends to make inequality itself a source of raw suffering for people. It tends to simplify the economic and social environment through isolating very poor people, through making monochrome environments like shopping centers instead of places like Nehru Place, which ghettoize the poor. And then we say, oh, we must do something about these ghettos, which are already created by this neoliberal regime. It's, if you like, economic complexity, which results in a kind of simplification of human experience. So for me, the challenge of governance, I don't know anything about city government, but I do know that the challenge of governance is to prevent that simplification so that inequality stands out as a humiliation, that it becomes an all-pervasive fact of life in which people feel that their inequalities mean that they're disabled. And the task of governance, as I understand it, is for government to prevent things like shopping centers, to not build social housing which only houses the poor, which creates a kind of condition in which those at the bottom become objects of pity. And that's something we can govern. We can govern through urban design, and I think we can also govern it through policy. But what I want to emphasize about this, and it's something that you heard in Saskia Sassen's presentation as well, that were you to now follow the path of neoliberalism in other parts of the world, that what you would produce is a more brutal and stark environment. And you have all these human resources. You know how to live in an informalized condition. That's to me, the Nehru Place it's a marvel of combining complexity for people who are very different. And that could all be destroyed in the name of a kind of development which is unregulated and uncontrolled. So as I say, I don't know how this translates into government policy. I do know how it translates into building and the kind of building we should do. Could I just say one final thing about this? I've been working on smart city technology for a bit. And one thing I think, if I could just offer it as a comment to you, a lot of this technology tends to over-expense and over-complexity. And I think if you're going to try and use big data, for instance, that you're going to have to find ways to use this technology in a smart way. Also for questions of justice, how are you going to democratize this? How is this not going to become an instrument of state control? But at the technical level, what we're doing is often what happens with new technologies is that they become excessively complicated. Any of you who have used a Microsoft word processing program will know intuitively what I'm talking about. And the notion of achieving what mathematicians call elegance in the use of technology as in any kind of scientific endeavor is how to avoid this kind of complication, very profitable. It's extremely profitable, which essentially is a bad use by not being smart about what you actually want to accomplish. You don't need very complex technology to do what you've laid out. You don't need to pay a lot of money, but you do need to pay attention to ways in which this, again, does not simplify people's experience in a rigid way. So that's but you understand the point I'm making about this. It's not inequality in itself which matters. It's how inequality is socially and economically constructed and materially constructed. That's what I think urban designers can help with.
Thank you, Richard. Gerald.
I think the problem of cities is first and foremost a problem of central governments. Central governments, states in India and in the United States have the power to create cities that deal with the problems of inequality and the problems of government that you eloquently spoke about. So the first thing that we need for smart cities is smart states. So smart states, to create smart cities, need to give them a brain. And a brain is not a computer. A brain is the ability to think about the future of the city and then the ability to implement it. And the states do not give cities a brain. They could. One of the ingredients of having this brain would be to be able to work with the state to enable them to implement their policies. The other ingredient is to enable them to work with their own citizens so the citizens feel part of the process. This is not an easy thing to do. There's a lot of fake participation and fake popular consent. To be smart and to be able to implement and be able to relate to people in the population requires an enormous amount of intelligence that the states need to empower the cities to do. This problem is way more intense if you're going to create a new city. If you create a new city, you're going to have to consult with people, but the people aren't there yet. The only people there are the few people who will probably be displaced by the new city when it comes. The new city will have people who don't even know they're going to be there. How are you going to organize a city that has responsive to its population before it has a population? You have to enable the city to have a brain and be smart enough to organize itself to deal with mistakes. It will make regular mistakes. It has to be able to change policies so that if you plan in advance, if instead of giving the cities a brain, you order them like a robot to do things, they will not be able to adjust and will not be able to listen to their own citizens and will not be smart. Smart is not a technology. Smart is being able to think and to do.
Thank you. Anumita, the floor is yours.
Right, that's a very interesting question. And I'll reposition the question a little bit. It's not really a matter of absence of outreach, but outreach by whom? And if you map out today the conflict, the urban conflict that we have noticed and seen across the cities and towns of India around water, around waste, around displacement, the conflict that shows there is simmering anger, there is outrage amongst the people who are affected by this, but the question is why there is no political articulation of that outrage, and not strong enough to change the debate around it, strong enough to make inequality the center stage of policymaking. Now, having said that, and clearly, therefore, what we're really looking for, that it is happening because of the exclusionary policies that we are following today, and it is reflected just not in their economic marginalization, but the way we are also organizing the urban space. So the whole exclusive and the gated development that we have, which has become the fashion of the day, it really hasn't found the design solution which we had earlier. We are moving away from that. So if we go back to the older parts of the cities where you had the mixed income group in Chandni Chowk, in Paharganj, and other parts of the older parts, but the new development is moving away from that, which means we are not the legacy of our own wisdom. We are losing that somewhere along the way. But we can go on and we can find a whole range of reasons what is affecting the inequality. But I think it is more important for us to understand the little bit of change that is still happening through self-empowerment. And I think we need to focus more on that. If you look at today what we are so dismissive about, the slums, we don't want to see slums. But keep in mind the fact that the formal housing is not going to meet the requirement of housing in this country for the poor. And whatever we have met so far, it is through self-construction and incremental housing. And that is part of the development which we would want. And what we are seeing today, interesting cases from Dharavi, from Shivaji Nagar in Mumbai, even in parts of Delhi, where it is interesting to see how the poor people, when they're doing the housing, the linking up microfinance, even the professional community of architects coming forward to inform how should they design their small little houses. And this is the linkage that we want to see grow and be supported more strongly in the future. Then there is another part of the story, and what is aggravating this? Today, through the policies, we are trying to create a platform of engagement with the community to inform policies. We want public participation. But the public, and who is public, who is participating there? And therefore, the formal participatory process does not represent the people who are affected and marginalized by the new policies and the new change. But their formal participation, and that is something we need to understand, is not so much the formal process of engagement, but protest as a form of negotiation. And therefore, we will really have to find that how do we build that into our future discourse, discussion, and the policy making. And finally, another point is that our cities have not really understood, and that is a unique challenge of the developing world and India. Today, you heard these two statistics in the morning. In Delhi, 85% of people still walk, cycle, take public transport, right? 24% of the city has green areas. Now that sounds like a dream city. I mean, that's the kind, if the number is what you need to believe, then that's what you want. But what we have not understood is in that, what we call as public transport, and that for the poor, the informal systems that have developed, evolved very spontaneously in our cities, what we call today the intermediate public transport. And how today, when we talk about all of us sitting around the table, about what the public transport should look like in the future, it's about BRT Metro. And when we fund and bring big money to it, we see the first conflict in city happening between the transport of the poor and the public transport of the rich. And then what you do is to try and get rid of the public transport of the poor. So you don't want the auto rickshaws, you don't want the cycle rickshaws on your street because they're taking away your passengers because you want to improve the profits of the bus and the metro. So clearly, therefore, we have to understand the poor people. It's just not, they are in the many ways in our part of the world are finding their own solutions. We have to learn to integrate their solutions with our planning. And that's what will be the inclusive city all about.
We'll now go back to our people who made the original presentations and begin with Ishar, as we did. And maybe you would like to reflect on what Anumita said about integrating the solutions of the poor into our policies, or reflect on what other panelists spoke about.
I mean, there's absolutely no question that we have to integrate the solutions of the poor in planning our cities. In fact, one of the things that we, as the Committee on Urban Infrastructure and Service Delivery recommended very strongly was that you should not have two separate ministries for urban development and housing and poverty alleviation, because we believe that you can't plan for the poor separately from planning for a city. And I'm very happy to see that one of the first acts of this government was to integrate housing and urban poverty alleviation with Ministry of Urban Development, and now we have one secretary sitting there who's supposed to plan while looking after the poor. So there's no question that the question is how we do it. Now, one thing that I would like to stress, when I said demand for good governance begets, then you get supply of good governance, is that my own travels to different cities, small, medium, large in India, has shown me that wherever e-governance has been used intelligently, and there are about 6 or 8 cities where I can say that has happened, which means not just putting some computers on your desk and asking people to register their grievance online, but actually have back-end integration, have software packages in different departments which are integrated. That has really generated a response in better service delivery, which even I would not have thought possible. Because we would think that only the rich have access to computers, but actually by setting up internet cafes and all, you have cities like Kalyan, Dombivli, Pune, Pimpri Chinchwad, Bangalore, Hyderabad, where governance delivery has been significantly improved by the use of e-governance. So that part of smartness also leads to inclusion. Transparency means that, you cannot get away with discretion. But there are setbacks. There is an example in in Hyderabad, where they actually set up they hired people with mobile telephones to go and take real-time pictures of dump sites to see if the people who were supposed to clear the garbage from there and transport them, at a certain distance, were doing that. And this information would be recorded on the public space and would be available to people. And the absenteeism went down, cleanliness went up, And it was a splendid result that you saw with the use of this technology, but only to find that when I was updating my case study in December 2013 and made several checks, I found out that they had actually withdrawn that. And this was because the unions made a whole lot of protests. So these mobile phones were set aside. And I remember the Municipal Commissioner of Hyderabad in 2011 telling me, we've taken away the right to lie, but they gave back the right to lie. And just to sort of, where I had gone to present my book, which had all these stories, to the Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister of Singapore, and he was flicking through the pages, and suddenly he tells me, oh, how did they do this in Hyderabad? So I said, I'm very curious, then why is it that in these 3 minutes that you're flicking through it, you zeroed in on that? And he said, because, we've been toying with that idea. So I wanted to see how it was successful. Then I pointed out to him that we had gone that far, but we retracted. So I believe in the power of technology, but with that, you need political will and leadership to resist those kinds of, opposition that will always come up.
Turn over to Harsh. Do you have any ideas you want to respond to on use of technology to dehumanize our cities?
No, I think, if I could, I'd rather respond to Richard's very thoughtful point about whether inequality in itself is a problem when we imagine smart cities.
Speak into the mic.
Yeah. So I said I'd like to respond to Richard's comment about whether inequality in itself is a problem when we imagine smart cities. I think inequality is a problem, but I would say it's inequality with three things. Inequality with, first, the idea of illegitimacy. Somehow, the idea that the urban poor who come into the city are not legitimate citizens. I remember one television debate where people were, going on and on about migrants coming into the city and so on. And suddenly I just had an idea, and there were a lot of young people, and I said, just 1 minute, who in this room has grandparents who belong to Delhi? And literally one hand, that was actually of the anchor, Vikram Chandra, he alone, all of us are migrants, but somehow poor migrants are illegitimate citizens. That creates a certain sense of that you don't have the same kind of rights. The second is inequality with a sense of illegality. Now, that they're not only illegitimate, but they're also illegal. So every effort, where your house is, where you go and defecate, where you go and bathe, where you do your livelihoods, everything is illegal. It's inequality with the idea of illegality of the poor. And sometimes illegality grows into criminalization. So we have beggary laws which actually say that to beg is a crime for which you can be put in places much worse than jails, from 1 year to 3 years to 10 years for repeated offenders. And begging is defined as having no ostensible means of livelihood, which is, to my mind, means destitution. So destitution is a crime for which you can put into something worse than a jail for 10 years. So that is a problem. And when you talk about outrage by whom, how can you exercise outrage and protest if you're considered an illegal citizen? You want to get away from the law. You don't want to be seen. So whenever these people I see are driven away, they're like grass which sort of goes down in a storm and then comes back because they have nowhere else to go. But they won't protest. So there's illegality with, and the third is illegality with indifference. And it is about this, that to my mind is really the biggest problem about caring, and I keep coming back to it. The fact that we don't care about how extremely desperate are the kinds of lives. I was in Pune, and just to give one illustration, in Pune we found 5,000 people living in what is called a slum. On where the railway station ends, there's where the shunting happens. They're actually living on the shunting thing. And children are playing, etc. 16 times a day, the train shunting hum, they jump off, they're cooking, they jump off, the train comes, train goes back, and then they come back. That kind of completely subhuman living. People die, when you're released from a hospital. First, you don't get into a hospital at all if you are homeless and you look destitute. Even if we force their way in, legitimately also a hospital after a few days says, okay, now you go home and let your family take care of you. I don't have a home, I don't have a family. It doesn't matter. So what do? So I have TB, so I go out and there's no place, I don't get nutrition, I can't have a place to rest, I die. We have people who have a simple road injury because of homeless people have, that accumulates into permanent disability. So I'm saying that inequality with illegitimacy, illegality, and indifference is the problem. And those are very, very fundamental problems in the imagination of our city.
But are you talking? This is very, very moving, what you said, but what I hear you talking about is not inequality, which is a relative measure, but absolute degradation, which is another story altogether. And what I don't think we can do is conflate the two. The notion of degrading a human being is a subject in itself. What's happening in urbanism is that it's producing, neoliberal urbanism produces conditions of neglect, that is from the elites, middle classes of those below, which tend to be different than they were in the past. But still, I think the problem you're putting your hands around is how do we find a basic minimum, a dignified minimum for human beings, and that has to be treated apart from questions of class structure.
Can I answer just one minute? When Sheila Dikshit was speaking before, she kept saying BRT was not accepted by the people. I just was finding it amazing. The people means us. Who doesn't accept it? The others are not the people. And when the Aam Aadmi Party, there was a party which had come up and said it would give cheap water and electricity. Amartya Sen made a very interesting point. He said, I wish them the best. They have to just decide, Aam Aadmi means the common person. They have to decide who is the Aam Aadmi, he said. Is it the person who wants cheaper water and electricity or the person who has no water and electricity? My problem is not just the ones who lead the most degraded lives. I tell them because they're the ones that move me the most.
Yes.
But there's a significant segment of people to whom we don't believe deserve, so we look at slums as places of squalor, as if they're somehow, which we'd like to clean up, as if they're somehow responsible for that condition of squalor. Now, I'm saying that it is a much larger population which are being affected by the sense of not really being legitimate members of this city.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. I would like to sort of extend what Richard is saying, Harsh. Yeah. I think there is a lot of us, and a lot of us, if there is an us and them, a lot of us do contribute and participate in little acts of kindness that perhaps satisfy a certain kind of compassionate, need, actually. I'm not sure that we can transpose that into a governance structure, or at least certainly not without actually the compassionate kings and princes and such like that we've known in the past, that we read about. But certainly what seems to be on offer here, potentially is, and I'd like to sort of cite two names here, and forgive me for dropping these names, but I think there are two problems here that need to be talked about in the context of smart cities. One is that, partly taking from what Richard is expressing as a somewhat skepticism about the use of technology, is that we are facing a huge backlog of stuff that we haven't done when it comes to dealing with our cities. So, what if I may refer to it as sort of what Habermas said, as an unfinished project. There is a modern city in this country that has simply not become modern. It's never really developed the plans. It hasn't developed the infrastructure. It hasn't developed the wherewithal, the administrative structure, and so on and so forth. So there is a possibility with the use of technology to speed up some of that work. And that's essential. The digitization of land records can be a complete game changer in this conversation about access to land, which right now is mired in a kind of asymmetry of information and opacity of any kind of so-called transparency and sharing of information that we are not able to break out of, because everybody is trying to change the information. And just one other aspect to this, and that's, you know, the whole idea of representation of voices and communities. And I voiced this yesterday to Sue Parnell. I think it's a big problem in our context here. The fact that we are now breaking it down up to the level of the community, and we're not thinking about individuals and their aspirations and their liberties. So, you know, what Gayatri Spivak said in the 90s, who speaks, is a big question in our society today. Representation is, and the community has become a mediator, it's become a pressure valve that helps individuals negotiate with very oppressive structures. But it doesn't necessarily mean that those individuals are only looking for representation through communities. They want very singular dreams to be met. Sorry.
I'm new to this whole urban debate, and I'm not an expert. I look at it more from the view of a citizen and somebody who was in business for 25 years. I'm less concerned about the use of technology, because we are a relatively intelligent bunch of people, and I think the way Mr. Agarwal defined smart makes a lot of sense. I think it has to be done, it must be done. But I think if we stopped the definition of our cities at that point, we would have left it at a very mechanical level. And I think what we're really looking for, what we're really fighting for, and I'm going to use a big word, what we're really fighting for is the soul of Indian cities. And underlying that, I think, is a question of identity, of who you are as an Indian. I think we had an identity after the independence, and then it's got depleted. Because at the end of the day, as far as I live, and I think even if I had grandchildren as far as they would live, I think we're going to have inequality of various kinds. But we also have opportunity of various kinds. I mean, Bombay is so wealthy because it has the big immersion process of Ganesha, right? Because it celebrates 5 festivals. It brings the city alive. It brings it into a living entity. We have so many religions. We have rich and we have poor. We have a lot of young people. And so for me, the question is, how are we going to make a space for all these different facets of India without judging them as good, bad, rich, poor, inside, outside? They're just going to be there. And my own instinct, and you guys are the experts, so you might think I'm being very naive, is my own instincts is the consultation process with citizens might give you a yes or a no. But these choices, which are allocation choices, are really made by enlightened leaders and enlightened bureaucrats. Because consumers and citizens don't really know what the alternate reality looks like. They've never lived it. They've never been there. And so for me, the real issue is not whether we will get the mechanics of smartness right. It is whether we will be able to define an Indian city which reflects all the richness of our heterogeneity, right? And which takes us from who we were to the potential of who we are by just making spaces and letting it evolve. This place will keep evolving.
So I'm going to use my chair's privilege to step outside of our panel and invite someone who's opened the conference, Jan Klaus, to reflect on an interesting paradox, if you will, that perhaps runs through our conversation here and through our couple of days, and that is that we are placing some amount of faith in better planning at a time when many of the problems we're discussing have perhaps been produced by planning. So you started the conference by asking us to think about a new paradigm of how we plan. Do we also need a new paradigm of who plans?
Thank you very much. I think that the question is very at the point. I think I talk about new paradigms in plural because the complexity of the society requires a diversity of solutions. What we are here witnessing, to my point of view, is that something that in the West we are already not seeing, that you in India, you are now in the drawing board. You are going to build new cities, you are going to produce a huge urbanization process, and in the West, we don't do that already. And then it's up to you now. It's your turn to produce the new paradigm of urbanization. And we are going to look at you. What is what you are going to do? Because we know how our cities were built. For example, our cities in the modernist movement with Corbusier, it was a time, for example, that the relation between capital and population was established through the dialogue between capital and unions. And unions were asking and fighting and dying for good, decent housing. And the capital produced decent housing, not because they thought that it was intelligent, it was blah, 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 blah. No, 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 no. They produced housing because it was a fight. And the solution of the fight, the pact, was the kind of, let's say, social democrat city of Europe, or perhaps with some variants in America. But now the question is the democracy, all the debate that is going on here. Who is talking in the name of who? Who is now representing the rights of the poor in this dialogue between the elite and the majority? Who has the power to fight for decency for the majority? And this is, of this fight, I hope, it's going to come out the new urban model. Because now, which are our livelihoods? What are going to be the livelihoods of your immense population in your cities? They are not going to be manufacturers. How are they going to win the rights? Because the rights are there. You know, they are not going to have the rights given just by generosity. Then the question is that the new model of the city, the one which is going to substitute, hopefully, the international model of urbanization that we are suffering around the world, and I hope that you will avoid, will need to come about solving one question that has been in this table during the 3 days, and it's about which is the governance, who represents the majority in this debate? Who defends the right of the decency to the ones who, if they don't organize themselves, they are not going to reach and to obtain what they are dreaming of? Then this is the question of the new paradigm of urbanization. How the governments, and I am with Fruk, the governments, they will try to do whatever they can. But the question here is, where is the fight for the good city? And this is the lesson that I take out of this fantastic Urban Age conference in Delhi. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So as you can tell, we're beginning to wind down here, and I want to thank the speakers and panelists, and I also want to give Daryl a chance to say a few closing words. And we are very delighted to hear from Joan Closs about the great fight, which we also heard about from previous speakers. My closing thought, particularly in relation to this panel, is that we need to think about the ways in which the world's great democracies reproduce spatialized inequality. And I'm still holding on to that idea of inequality because I'm interested in moving the conversation from how we reverse neglect or how we deal with the deprived to thinking about how we tackle wealth, power, and privilege, and how in particular we tackle the ways in which urban planning has repeatedly reproduced those forms of wealth, power, and privilege. So, in fact, thinking about social change and thinking about a transformation of those inequalities might require us to step outside the somewhat safe boundaries of both governance and government.
Well, Ananya has said what I want to say, but much more eloquently. As a journalist, I raise questions. And what bothers me is the constant emphasis on infrastructure, smart cities, corridors, highways, coastal highways. So the emphasis on that kind of infrastructure with the absence of who it's going to benefit. Smart cities itself, if one looks at, in a country such as we have, where 1 in 4 people don't even have electricity, not to mention lack of drinking water, sanitation. So I think the dangers of this kind of building-led kind of development is the exclusion of vast masses. And India, as somebody correctly pointed out today, we won't point to India being necessarily a good example of democratic government. So it is going to witness one of the biggest transformations the world has ever seen in terms of people coming to cities. So what those cities will be, what will we see in the years to come, I think is something of debate, and we should all be joining that debate, such as Urban Age has provided. Thank you so much.
Thank you.